It's a unique operational environment. It's very demanding operational environment. Both Finland and Sweden has a long capability and a long tradition is in fighting up north, and that has turned tables a lot. And Russia's capability to, well, currently there's nobody basically. They have the garrisons are empty. There are some conscripts and very few officers and NCOs. No operational capability at all.
He had this vision for a really big prestige project, the opening up of the Arctic as a sea route of which Russia would have complete control.
Absolutely.
The resources that were there, the oil and gas, the minerals, and a military presence that would recapitalise the radar system, the early warning system that would counter any sort of US, NATO military supremacy with attacks coming over the poles. But the reality is that he can't afford to do any of that whilst fighting the war in Ukraine.
Some of the claims that he's been suggesting is that they could run the Arctic Maritime Commercial Highway, albeit with China, hence the building of, which we haven't got onto, the fleet, which has been very slow in development, of big nuclear icebreakers, 15,000 tonners. He really is looking as if he's beginning to bite more than he can swallow, than he can digest. But when he's in this posture and he's in an offensive mode of thinking, he is really dangerous.
Hi, I'm James Heappey, and this is Superpowers on Times Radio. It's long been an ambition of Soviet and Russian leaders to create a foothold in the Arctic, expanding north with the aim of controlling its strategic value and untapped resources. Vladimir Putin is no different. As he attempts to return Russia to its Soviet-era glory days, he has put the region at the forefront of his global plans. In 2007, divers put a Russian flag on the seabed beneath the Arctic floor. At the time, this wasn't taken too seriously, but now Putin has expanded the Russian military significantly in the region, owning nearly half of the polar territory. This gives Putin access to billions of tons of gas and oil, and crucially, a global transport route he hopes will one day rival the Suez Canal. But Putin isn't the only player interested in the region. Xi Jinping wants to muscle his way into China becoming an Arctic superpower too. Meanwhile, Biden and his Western allies are scrambling to keep up. Finland and Sweden have entered into NATO. America's military bases, predominantly in Alaska, are old and in a state of disrepair. For once, the US has found itself dead last in a three-horse race. So how can the US and its allies strengthen its position in the Arctic? And is a war for the region inevitable? Today, we're joined by the defence editor for the Evening Standard, Robert Fox, and retired Finnish Major General Pekka Toveri. So, Robert, I'll come to you first, because in many ways, the discussion of the Arctic that's become so fashionable in recent years isn't that new. All the way through the Cold War, the Arctic was really important. NORAD was incredibly well resourced because the strategic missile exchange, if that moment ever came, would have been over the North Pole. So give us a sense of, firstly, what people mean when they're talking about the High North, and secondly, what existed in those Soviet days.
Well, as you say, that there were missile defence. They were watching each other like hawks. It was, if anything, a bit of a Dr. Strangelove world, if you remember the scenario of that extraordinary satire. But there are several differences between then and now. First of all, it was more frozen than it is now. And that is why we get a change of dimension, because it is becoming more and more accessible. As you rightly have explained in your introduction, they see it as a major maritime commerce route coming round, principally from the cluster of ports around Shanghai, cutting the distance to Hamburg, but above all to the Europort in Rotterdam by many days. And that's why the Chinese have a very big dog in the fight. I think even, correct me, that Xi Jinping has talked about the ice Silk Road. So you'll see a relationship with Russia there. Now, the important thing to note about Putin is that this has been a fixation with Putin before Ukraine. You may well note that in his meetings with American presidents, and particularly with Trump, he mentions the Arctic. He mentions it again. He mentions it again when he's meeting Biden or Biden's officials, and he mentions it in his State of the Union speech, and I think that this is what we're going to explore. It's part of Putin's vision of the Putin imperium. He wants Russia to be seen as a global strategic power, and the maritime component is very, very important to it. He alludes to it from time to time, whether he can do it, but the high Arctic is very important because it's valuable. It's valuable because of the resources, the drilling. It's going on land and on the seabed as well, or rather the exploration. That is a given, but it's part of a huge vision that must be taken seriously. It involves the Baltic. Sadly, it involves the Black Sea. It involves the Eastern Mediterranean. Look at the deal they've done with Khalifa Haftar over Benghazi, and it's gestural at the moment, but doing exercises with Iranian ships there, sometimes Indians and the Chinese off the Straits of Hormuz. So, Breakfast at Tiffany's. Holly Golightly, the protagonist, in the marvellous phrase of Truman Capote, she wasn't really a phony because she was phony about the things that she was phony about. This is Putin. It's part practical, it's part real, it's part geopolitical poker playing for advantage, but it is very much of how Putin sees Putin Russia. L'État, c'est moi. Louis XIV. It's Putin and Putinism, and it is a crucial part of it, as is Ukraine.
Robert, thank you. Pekka, there's the difference between the competition in the High North in the Cold War and the competition in the High North now is most visibly displayed, I think, in the fact that there are now Finland and Sweden as NATO members. And that completely changes the necessity for Russia to invest in its northern forces, no longer just worrying about the northern coastline and the protection of its naval bastion. The land frontage between NATO and Russia has doubled as a consequence of Finland's accession to NATO. So what does that mean for NATO in the way that it must now think about the way it fights in the High North, given that half of its frontage with Russia is in the High North?
Well, as very well described, Arctic is very important for Russia. Russia has truly an Arctic soul, whereas you have to remind the United States every now and then that, hey guys, you are also an Arctic nation. Understanding there has improved a lot, but Arctic is very important for Russia and it's Russia's future. And currently it has become more and more important because it's the only area where Russia still has a more military power than the West has. It's the only area where they can say that we are stronger, and Russia has been building military capabilities there for 15 years. But now, when Putin then attacked Ukraine and Finland and was the best NATO salesman of the year and made Finland and Sweden to join NATO, it was the biggest strategic blunder that Putin has made so far, because Finland and Sweden joining NATO has totally changed the military strategic situation up north in Northern Europe, and it is turned the tables totally. And in Russia's capability in a possible conflict between NATO and Russia's capability to protect its assets in Kola Peninsula have declined considerably. And I'd say that it's more or less impossible for them to go offensive anymore.
So for viewers and listeners that are not familiar with the importance of the Kola Peninsula borders a big chunk of northern Finland, and it is the place where the Russian Northern Fleet, where the Russian nuclear arsenal is based. They are all home ported on that peninsula. And that fleet is the principal challenge to NATO in the North Atlantic. So traditionally, NATO has done an awful lot of work. Throughout the Cold War, Norway was a NATO member, and the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap was a really important focus of NATO effort. But now for Putin, he finds himself with not just the naval challenge from NATO coming around the top of the Norwegian Sea and into the Barents Sea, but he also sees NATO lined up, barely a few hundred miles from Murmansk on the Finnish border as well. Can Putin afford to resource all of his military districts to the degree necessary, given the scale of the frontage that Russia now has with NATO?
Well, I doubt. And the fact is that when you look at the high north, you understand that it's a unique operational environment. It's very demanding operational environment. And for example, United States and NATO countries before Finland and Sweden joined in had very few forces which are trained and equipped to operate in that environment. And that also includes air forces. And now both Finland and Sweden has a long capability and a long tradition is in fighting up north, and that has turned tables a lot. And Russia's capability to, they have currently 3 brigades there, 2 motorized infantry brigades and one marine brigade. Well, currently there's nobody basically. They have the garrisons are empty. There are some conscripts and very few officers and NCOs, no operational capability at all. Just to build up that capability to full force and fully manned brigades will take time. And with these 3 brigades, you can't go to offensive, or you can go, but it will end up very badly for you. They've tried it before, doesn't work. So then start to enlarge them to divisions, which is one of their plans. It will take a long time. I'd say decade is at least, so we have time to react. And even though if they have this offensive capability there, to conduct offensive in Northern Europe is not that easy. The Germans tried it in Second World War, didn't go well. The Russians tried it another way, didn't go too well either, attacking Finland. Therefore, what comes more crucial than land power, I think, is the air power. And there we are much more superior. The NATO is much more superior up north. In Alaska, United States have soon around 100 F-35s and F-22s. Russia don't have a single real 5th generation fighter plane. In European high north, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark alone have over 250 fighter planes, and in 2030s, 153 of them are F-35s. So the situation doesn't look too good for us, and the capability to seriously threaten NATO up north are declining.
Robert, this is a key point. That
yes,
the demands of the war in Ukraine has meant that Putin, as Pekka just illustrated, has raided both the eastern military district, so the navy based out at Vladivostok, but also the northern military district, to throw more people into the meat grinder in Ukraine. And the cost now, Pekka, as a Finnish major general, will regard operating in -30 as routine business. But actually, these are incredibly highly specialized skills.
Yeah.
And so, for all that 6 or 7 years ago, we were seeing this huge investment in new bases all the way along the Russian Arctic coastline. What we've seen since is actually the disinvestment from the high north by Putin out of necessity.
Even some, as you say, naval infantry being pulled back for the. I think that the manpower situation, as described by Pekka, is absolutely critical to the whole story, and we don't know enough about what is really going on with Ukraine, because which is the hub of this. Putin has made extraordinary claims that up to 750,000 are now involved in the special military operation. Let me be clear about Pekka. I'm not saying that they're in Ukraine, but involved in Ukraine, on the border, in the defense industries, the logistics to that. That's quite a big bill, particularly as it looks as if really dangerous things are coming off in the Middle East. It would be extremely worrying if Israel gets involved in a deep operation in South Lebanon with Hezbollah, because then it gets even more global, as you might see. And I just want to say it is just a conjecture, and perhaps the general knows more, something about this. What was Putin really up to with Kim Jong-un? rockets, defensive. We knew all that anyway. But what you get from the margins, and it is very local and it is uncorroborated, they talked about manpower. Whether you could get North Koreans to come in, I'm not saying to fight in Ukraine as mercenaries or whatever, but to backfill, because they've not only got a desperate situation or a very difficult situation, as so eloquently described, across the Arctic, but also along, as we are understanding from sporadic reports, but they are reports from the spot, of disorders and troubles in the remote Russian-Chinese border. So I think we're saying, to draw this together, that yes, there is a strategy. He has a strategic vision, but there's also, in addition to the protection of the Kola Peninsula, absolutely right, in the missile exchange, some of the claims that he's been suggesting is that they could run the Arctic Maritime Commercial Highway, albeit with China, hence the building of, which we haven't got onto, the fleet, which has been very slow in development, of big nuclear icebreakers, 15,000 tonners. He really is looking as if he's beginning to bite more than more than he can swallow, than he can digest. But when he's in this posture and he's in an offensive mode of thinking, he is really dangerous.
Look, you've taken the word straight out of my mouth, and that is the dynamic that strikes me. That he had this vision for a really big prestige project of the opening up of the Arctic as a sea route, of which Russia would have complete control.
Absolutely.
The resources that were there, the oil and gas, the minerals, and a military presence that would recapitalize the radar system, the early warning system that would counter any sort of US, NATO military supremacy with attacks coming over the poles. But the reality is that he can't afford to do any of that whilst fighting the war in Ukraine. So, Pekka, the thing that concerns me is that what we're seeing is, in order to not let go of that ambition altogether, Putin is increasingly turning to the PRC, who of course have an enormous interest in a shortened sea route between China and European markets. And Xi has been very clear that he regards himself as a near Arctic, or in fact as an Arctic power, which rather affronts Putin's sense of historic Russia, when the maps that showed China as an Arctic power include sort of most of Eastern Russia as Chinese. But what does that mean for Northern Europe if that sea line of communication with China opens up? Because on the one hand, big opportunity. On the other, hugely empowering for Putin and his successors with control over that sea lane.
Well, the Russians, as you well described, the Russians think that they own Arctic, and they have a right to there. And they have, so far, they've kept Chinese on arm's length, haven't allowed them to come too strongly to Arctic. But now Russia is so weak because of war in Ukraine, and so depending on China and China's support, that I don't think that they can keep the Chinese out. So we will see more and more Chinese shipping and activities there. And my problem is that when you look how China operates, they always start with scientific research. They come and do scientific research on the maritime area, which is actually good way also to do some reconnaissance and planning for how to use submarines in the area. After the scientific research, they always come with the business activities, and that is always followed by military. We've seen that happen in South China Sea. We have seen this happening in Indian Ocean and in Horn of Africa. So why would that be any different in Arctic? And China is building its capabilities. They are building icebreakers. They are building and preparing capability to use submarines in up north and so on and so on. So I would be very wary. Yes, it gives some possibilities for trade with China, but again, there are also a lot of threats, and we have to be very careful. China has been very active in trying to buy critical infrastructure in Northern Europe several times, and we've been able to stop those activities. But again, we have to be very careful with that.
I mean, it's the opening up of the sea route is a real challenge to Russia. They've enjoyed the fact throughout the Cold War that the Russian coastline east of the Kola Peninsula is what we would call in the UK a cul-de-sac, a kind of no-through road. And so in the White Sea and the Kara Sea, that's exactly where they've been doing the trialling of all of their most sensitive submarine technologies. It's where they do their nuclear weapons testing. And so all of a sudden, you know, the world having a rite of passage along that northern coastline, you can see why Putin is so keen to preserve his sovereignty over that coastline and control of the sea lane. And so I'm really interested in both of your perspectives, because here, the interests of Xi and the interests of Putin are definitely not aligned, and yet they see benefit in working together. My suspicion, to start the conversation off, is that Xi knows in the long term there's only one winner, that Russia becomes so entirely dependent on China that, frankly, China gets what it wants and Russia has to deal with the fact that the Kara Sea and the White Sea are no longer super secret locations in which they can do these tests. Robert, what do you think?
Well, I think you're right, because I think it was in the aftermath of the Trump-Putin meeting that he mentioned these places specifically, that the coast, the Arctic coast is Russian, and the 7 inlet seas. I don't know, the translation came out rather badly. Are Russian sovereign territory, hands off. Following what Pekka was saying about starting with science, going with commerce, and thinking of the future of international regimen, law, things like the law of the sea, which America has been very reluctant about, as you know, which you really need in these places. I think we have to look very carefully at something which is so important for the future of polar science, which is now vital to understanding climate change and so on, in Antarctica. Because China is up to the same game, discreetly again. It's working through clients, it's wooing the cone countries, Chile, but particularly Argentina,
South Africa,
to go in to breach the Antarctic Treaty, which is demilitarized, as you know, 1961. And this is quite a template, because we know what Argentina is. They've declared it. They're after the extension of the Malvina Basin, they're after energy, they're after minerals, and so on. And it is part of the global feature. And actually, since we're talking from London, where the Brits have a very big role for very low investment, which so impressed Mrs. Thatcher, and it's called the British Antarctic Survey. It only is a slack handful of about tens of millions of pounds, but they do terrific science. It's fundamental science. They discovered, confirmed by NASA, the hole in the ozone layer, for example. And they are the epitome of this peaceful cooperation led by people like Vivian Fuchs and so on, from the geopolitical year, the Great Antarctic Year of '58, and this treaty, which has always seemed to be dying post-Cold War, but it is still very much there. And what is going on in Antarctica is quite an indicator for the Arctic. It's one of these strange things that we were talking before we came on air, where NATO powers, not as NATO per se, but as allies and friends and like-minded, have a common interest there as well, particularly Britain, America, and this, for once, brings in Australia in a very big way.
So, Pekka, the parallel Robert draws there between Antarctica and the Arctic, it is true that you can see the renegotiation of the Antarctic Treaty becoming another one of these test cases as China and Russia seek to reimagine the global order. The Arctic Council feels nigh on defunct, although you may take a different view to that. The challenge to the UN Convention of the Laws of the Sea, as Putin seeks to claim entire control over a northern sea route that under UNCLOS routinely would be seen as a right of free passage. You can see the polar regions as the place in which this challenge between East and West over the global order starts to be really played out.
That is true. As activities increase there because of the climate change, both of business activities. It will eventually cause more and more military activities. West will have to answer to Russians' aggression and activities up north. And yes, we will have a new player there, China, too. So it will be very delicate. For long time in Arctic Council, the Western countries were trying to keep North Arctic area as non-military, peaceful area. We didn't want to go to competition on the military force, even though we saw that Russia is building its capabilities. But now it has to change. Unfortunately, you can't leave Arctic to playground for Russia and China. We have to have a capability to protect our interests there and so forth. And that, of course...
Do you think NATO is doing enough, Pekka? Do you think NATO is doing enough in really seeing and understanding and stepping forward to confront this new reality in the Arctic?
I'd say that there's been good steps. The fact that we have now Joint Forces Command Norfolk, which will be activated in full operational capability in couple of years. We have more exercises and so on. So some good steps, but I think that and I know that they hate in NATO, but I think that NATO should have an Arctic strategy and look more broadly on Arctic issues, how we can defend and what capabilities we need in the future for that. One problem, for example, is surface capabilities. Yeah. The Western navies are really not built to operate up north. No. They always say that, well, we have submarines, but there's things that you need to have a surface capabilities to also, and there's not even talks about starting to build capabilities that you can operate on surface in Arctic. U.S. Coast Guard has a 1.5 icebreaker. Russia has the biggest icebreaker fleet in the world, 40. We in Finland have the second biggest in the world, about 10. But there are...
And Canada is very small, amazingly, isn't it?
Yes,
it's about 3 or 4, really capable. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are clear capability gaps up north for NATO, which we should address and start working on.
Pekka, I know that NATO is looking at its command and control laydown with the accession of Finland and Sweden. Where, in your view, as NATO seeks to develop a strategy for the High North, and with it, as you've both just been discussing, developing the capabilities necessary for the High North, does NATO need to consider a new command that sort of starts from the Gulf of Finland and goes northwards, but then that separates from a command and control perspective the Sweden and Finland from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania? I'd be interested in your perspective of how best NATO embraces its new position in the High North, whilst not creating an incoherence between Finland and Estonia, which is quite an important bit of geography.
Well, I understand that there are a lot of delicacies and delicate things in this discussion, because our idea is that yes, all the Nordic countries, hopefully United States, UK, United States, Canada, would be under Joint Forces Command Norfolk, and there are several benefits on that. One being that the countries who have most strongest Arctic interest and most capable forces to operate in Arctic would be on the same command. And I think that the High North is crucial for Europe's defense, because if High North fails, the Europe fails. Yeah. Therefore, that's much more important. When you look at then the Gulf of Finland, for example, AORs meet in the Gulf of Finland. Well, it's Gulf. It's easy to block. Seams are always vulnerable in military doctrine, even between Joint Forces commands. But that's something you can take care of with good planning and preparedness. I don't think that command-wise, the fights in the Baltic Sea region will be fought more south than Gulf of Finland. So I don't think that Joint Forces Command prunes some that there's a bigger problem in that northern countries would be in Norfolk area, and then the Baltic states would be under the Joint Forces Command Brunsum.
And can I just bring you back to the Arctic Council, because there have been pushes by particularly your neighbours in the Baltic to see Russia kicked out of the OSCE, which is one of the few forums in which the West has continued to engage Russia. And in theory, the Arctic Council similarly remains active. And I remember having conversations over the last few years with British diplomats that said actually the Arctic Council could be one of the channels through which the West and Russia continue to engage. As their neighbour in the Arctic, what's your view of that?
Well, I understand that Russia is actually planning to pull themselves out from OSCE so that we don't have to kick them out. But on the Arctic region, I'd say that there's still some cooperation ongoing. For example, Norway and Russia, they still have on practical level connections to handle day-to-day life, the security issues, rescue issues and stuff like that. And the Arctic Coast Guard still cooperate in some level, again, on the sea and rescue issues. And, yes, we need to show force to Russia. Yes, we shouldn't give up and leave Russia there. But I'd say that it might be beneficial still at least hold the Arctic Council together in hope that on practical means we have some venue where we can talk about important issues like protection of the environment, even though the Russians are not too interested about it, but it's more big interest for us, and other issues. And whether we like it or not, China will come to Arctic.
Yeah.
They already have stated that they want to be in this war world, for example. Then we have to, maybe we have to accept the fact and take them in account when we start to talk about in the future in Arctic, because when China comes, traditionally when China comes and starts its economical activities, they tend to be quite bad for environment. You look how they conduct fishing in the Pacific region is quite terrible. So if we at least have some venue where we can discuss with China about that and try to control its activities somehow, that it wouldn't be that damaging to environment, for example. Still, I think that might be good to at least for some years try to keep Arctic Council working, keep Russia there, maybe take even China as an observer, so that we could have this discussion ongoing and try to affect how they behave.
So I want to, time is running away from us, and I just want to finish by talking about the competition in space over the High North. I think our American cousins who from time to time have been guilty of trying to divide the theatres and say kind of park Russia and the Euro-Atlantic, that's no longer the US's concern, pivot everything towards China and the Indo-Pacific. Well, the Arctic is the place where those two regions really do merge. And, Russia has a new radar station barely 300 miles from the Alaskan coast. We know that Russia is increasingly drawing on Chinese satellite technology to develop its global positioning or precision timing capabilities in the High North. It is not something that we've seen come out of Xi-Putin summits so far, where they've agreed to use all of these things to provide a joint early warning system, but one can see how the partnership may evolve eventually into an alliance. So, Robert, if you were the next president of the United States,
good God,
to what degree would you be resourcing that competition in the High North and recognizing the threat that Russia faces not just to the US in the Atlantic, but actually to the US interests in the Pacific also?
If I was president, I would want a lot of off-book, very direct, private briefings, probably by the day, as to what is going on, particularly when things like quantum now, it is moving so fast, and deep space, where America and Europe have an interest, the deep space radar and so on. These are now essentials. What you're finding, James, and we're talking about, it is not entering the public discourse. Occasionally you will get something at the level of the Atlantic magazine, or I'm talking about broad spectrum, public, foreign policy, foreign affairs. This is not even being brought home to a discerning public. And I think it is absolutely vital, because the new dimensions of conflict, confrontation, possibly leading to warfare, as you rightly say, are space, low space, high space, cyber, and subaqua, which we're not talking about here, because it's a whole can of worms, to mix metaphors, when we look at what's happening under the oceans, particularly around the Arctic region, communications, energy, and so on. And it's a thing that it's not a bolt-on nuisance, which a lot of our financial ministries seem to think. This is an area we should be investing in deep research and prosecuting. You're right, and I agree with the General about OECE and the Arctic Council, the fora. Keep Russia in as much as you possibly can. Look, OSCE, its membership is a complete joke, because it totally violated the Helsinki Final Act by egregiously violating the sovereignty of a neighbour that it had guaranteed hitherto. We know all that. But where I'm absolutely with you is that if you can bind them in, if you can talk to them, because one of the whinges that you get from some of the, not necessarily from he himself, but from the propaganda coming from Moscow at the moment, is nobody talks to us. Look at us. Look at the way we've been ignored by the West. They're not engaging. And I think that that is a very, very big subject. But this is where, again, I am with Pekka. The fact is that this should be taking up a much greater focus of interest in NATO and our commonality and our alliances, space, the new dimensions. And the Arctic is right in the middle of it.
Absolutely. Pekka, I think you get the final word. It just struck me hearing Robert speak then that your neighbours, in terms of the next democracies eastwards from Finland, are the United States and Japan. And as this sea route opens up, Finland as a Pacific actor becomes a reality. Does NATO, to what degree, therefore, does NATO need to embrace this reality that as it competes with Russia in the High North, it is also competing with China also? And does that need to just remain unsaid, or should NATO actually explicitly be preparing for that reality?
Well, I say that definitely. You know, we are in an era of global big power competition. And China and Russia are challenging democratic countries. And since, especially in Arctic, when the European side and Pacific side are so connected in Arctic, we have to, you know, everybody talks about NATO as a transatlantic link, and we have our own AOR. We have to take a bigger map. We have to take the globe and think globally. And that means that, yes, we have to be able to connect with our, I think, future allies, not only partners, but future allies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and start to look this game that is ongoing a bit differently. We shouldn't just concentrate on our NATO AOR. Yeah. We have to be able to start operating globally, and that's probably starts in Arctic, because that's, you know, it's the final, it's the high ground of this Earth we are living in, and space above it is the high ground of the high ground. So yes, I totally agree that the space has a bigger and more important meaning in the future too.
Pekka, thank you very much. Another vintage superpowers conversation spanning 3 oceans, 5 continents, subsea, on the sea, and all the way up into space. You've been watching Superpowers on Times Radio with me, James Heappey. Thank you to my guests, Robert Fox and Pekka Toveri. For more episodes of Superpowers, subscribe to our YouTube channel. For now, thanks for watching and goodbye.
Bye.